The internet is full of debates and discussions surrounding topics of capitalism, socialism, inequality, and ethics. Central to all these discussions is social class. The internet, being the internet, has meant that the people having these discussions typically don't know what they're talking about.
Socialism is when the government does stuff.
Or at the very least, talk past each other because they don't understand what is meant by terms such as social class, let alone more complicated concepts that employ social class to their understanding, such as capitalism, communism, and intersectionality.
Maybe orthodox Marxist and an intersectionalist? I don't know.
Social class analysis attempts to explore the relationship between class and all sorts of social phenomena. It is one of the most powerful concepts within sociology, and it is rare to see an empirical paper without some mention of social class. With social class being so important, there is thus a need to understand what it is and what it is not. This is no easy question. The concept of social class has been defined and redefined for hundreds of years. Over the course of this video, I seek to take you on a journey through the major influences on social class and their utility. Marxist, Weberian, and Bourdieusian will all be discussed in due time. Without further ado, let us start with the most fundamental of definitions: gradational and relational social class. Gradational and relational social class. All conceptualizations of social class fall into one of two categories: gradational or relational, where gradational social class is characterized via categories based on ordering relations. Relational social class is characterized via categories based on relations of dependence. To deconstruct this rather vague language, Ossowski provides appropriate definitions for both. For gradational social class, the class division is conceived as a division into groups differentiated according to the degree in which they possess the characteristic which constitutes the criterion of division, as for instance, income level. As for relational social classes form a system according to their one-sided or mutual dependence, dependence being understood in both cases as a dependence based on causal relations. The concept of gradational social class can be further dissected into continuous and discontinuous forms of gradation. This refers to a debate surrounding if the categories allocated to certain classes can be considered real or whether they're purely conventional. In terms of operationalization of gradational social class, two examples stand out: class gradation in terms of income and class gradation in terms of social status. As Mayer and Buckley argue about the former definition, in a class system, the social hierarchy is based primarily on differences in monetary wealth and income. Class structure, based primarily in terms of income, produces a concept of social class that is near indistinguishable to the income distribution. In reference to this latter definition, Parsons argues that class ought to be defined as an aggregate of such units, individual and or collective, that in their own estimation and those of others in the society occupy positions of approximately equal status. Indeed, Williams rejects the gradation of social class in terms of income on the basis of a sociological critique of what amounts to an economist conceptualization of social class that offers very little value beyond the already established income distribution. Williams in fact states, the distribution of privileges begins to take on full sociological meaning only when it is related to prestige rankings, social interaction grouping, and beliefs and values held in common. In contrast to gradational conceptualizations of social class that have been illustrated thus far, Relational conceptualizations of social class define it by their structured social relationship to other classes. In other words, a relational perspective shares the gradational view of quantitative distinctions between classes, but the relational perspective adds to this a qualitative measure of difference. Classes are not simply defined relative to other classes, but in a social relation to other classes. An example from the Marxist school of thought: the working class is defined by its qualitative location within a social relation that at the same time defines the capitalist class. The capitalist class owns the means of production, and the workers their labour power to sell to that capitalist class. To note, all forms of class, even in its gradational variation, implicitly view inequality as a notion of social relations. Within its social status variety, for example, holding greater amounts of social status in comparison to someone else, a quantitative difference, is defined in relation to a qualitative measure of what that social status is and how it is valued and legitimized within society. As a final point of contrast, under a relational approach to social class, social relations do not simply define social classes. They also determine social classes as social forces that impact real consequences of social relations. Collective action, in other words. This does not presuppose any normative framework. Not all relational approaches to social class must be Marxist, nor do they have to be Weberian. Gradational class structures, on the other hand, are static. They can, of course, provide descriptive labels within given contexts, but ultimately they cannot be used to measure social forces that determine and transform categories of social class itself. For this reason, as well as its somewhat lacking sociological rigour, gradational conceptualizations of social class have either died out or been relegated to the field of economics with its association within income distributions. When we speak of matters of social class henceforth, we shall be speaking in terms of relational social class conceptualizations. Marx and social class. Within the Marxist tradition, class analysis includes several conceptual elements: class structure, formation, struggle, and finally, consciousness. The key conceptual divergence that Marxist interpretations of social class have with other varieties is centered upon the concept of exploitation. Exploitation itself provides explanatory power in the form of a mechanism-based approach to understand the socially stratified nature of contemporary society. Exploitation can be defined via three principles: the inverse interdependent welfare principle, the exclusion principle, and finally the appropriation principle. The first can be understood as the material welfare of exploiters causally dependent upon the material deprivations of the exploited. Relations are thus not just different, but antagonistic. The second is defined by the welfare of exploiters being dependent upon the exclusion of the exploited from access to certain resources. The third can be understood as exclusion generates material advantage to exploiters because it enables them to appropriate the labour effort of the exploited. By linking aspects of production to aspects of exchange, the social relations that congeal social class shapes individuals' locations both within exchange relations and within processes of production. By viewing social relations as determining social classes as social forces that impact real consequences of social relations. Exploitation as a concept defines issues of class antagonisms and conflict within society. This, in turn, presents power as a central issue in need of analysis. Gramsci, in fact, elevates this notion of power and exploitation through an analysis of coercion and consent. By linking concepts of exchange to concepts of production, Marxist interpretations of class allow for an analysis of class relations in an antagonistic setting. In this way, social class is pivotal in historical and comparative analysis. By advocating for an exploitation-based interpretation of social class, it allows for an analysis outside of market-based conditions and societies, unlike, for example, Weberian interpretations of social class. This conceptualization, however, appears to be more helpful as a form of historiography, rather than a tool of sociological analysis. As a concept, however, exploitation is one that is loaded with preconceived moral judgments, something that can be seen in another content creator, Vosh, with their perception that thought itself is a power struggle.
All of thought is just power grabs between people who can decide subjectively whether or not their positions are better than others.
Power grabs.
Unironically,
wow.
In some cases,
the truth of whether the Holocaust happened, a power grab.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
Well, with that, I'm going to peace out because I've never.
You
heard
didn't
anyone
make
say
a
that.
single.
And thus provides a definition of social class a priori. According to Bourdieu, by forming classes ahead of time, there is a risk of implying that social class is a self-subsistent entity. This refers to the debate surrounding continuous and discontinuous forms of gradation, or real and not real variations of social class. The working class and the upper class, two distinct class categories, form the substantial understanding of Marxist interpretation of social class. As mentioned previously, these two classes are quantitatively and qualitatively distinguished from one another. The problem Marxism faces, however, is the contemporary conceptualization of the middle class. These are people who do not own their own means of production, like the working class, and yet do not seem to be a part of the working class based on their employment relations. Thus, the concept of class differentiation is important to a Marxist conceptualization of social class. Authority refers to this problem of the middle class. Marxism reconciles this existence based upon property relations. In other words, capitalist production always involves an element of domination, involving surveillance, coercion, and control to ensure adequate performance on the part of the working class. Hence, the existence of a middle class. On top of this rationale, by treating authority as a lens of class differentiation, the strategic positions of the middle class, for example managerial roles, thus make claims towards a higher proportion of the surplus in the form of higher earnings in relation to their working class colleagues. The online content creator Perspective Philosophy gives a fantastic example of the so-called problem of the middle class from a Marxist perspective.
So if a doctor's earning like 500,000 a year or something, or a lawyer, is he a slave? And I was like, yes, I'll bite the bullet, like 100%, right? Because I think that at the end of the day, it's not about how much money you make. It's about
your relationship to your that's 100% true. A lot of people, because nobody actually knows anything about what Marx said, and even I barely know what Marx said, but a lot of people seem to think that if you make a lot of money, you're like you leave the proletariat or whatever. But anybody that has their labor extracted would be considered part of the same class.
Exactly. It's not about how much capital you've accumulated. It's about your place in the system and like how much control you have over your own life.
In addition to authority, the concepts of skills and expertise aid in class differentiation. The rationale for this being those individuals located within the middle class who possess high levels of skills and expertise are in a privileged location within exploitation relations. This position is incentivized by the capitalist class by greater material benefits in comparison to working class individuals. A particular point of prudence that Marxist interpretations of social class provides is that most individuals within any given society do not fill jobs within the paid labour force. Up until this point, all discussions and definitions have related to that paid labour force. Location within the class structure is understood to be something that has one's material interests shaped by one's relationship to the process of exploitation. Thus, family structures, and in particular kinship relations, are key identifiers in locating individuals within the wider class structure. The major critique of the Marxist interpretation of social class is that it is simply outdated. In relation to the historical power of Marxist social class, orthodox traditions, such as historical materialism, are unnecessarily deterministic influences that have long been abandoned by contemporary Marxist scholars. The labour theory of value was central to the exploitation-based model of social class, which again sees critiques claim such a model of social class as untenable. Neo-Marxism and social class. Contemporary scholarship on Marxist interpretations of social class have adopted a neo-Ricardian alternative that applies the concept of exploitation to that of neoclassical economics via the form of rents. Rents are defined as a payment in the context of the market to a factor of production more than the costs needed to bring that factor into production. This updated definition of social class adequately applies traditionally Marxist principles to contemporary society. It appears adequate in analysing the increase in earnings inequality as an example. Ultimately, whilst contemporary Marxist conceptualizations of social class overcome the traditional critiques of social class as exploitation linked to concepts of historical materialism and the labour theory of value, it still cannot overcome issues related to presupposed normativity. Overall, Marxist definitions of social class can be helpful in forms of historical analysis and in the analysis of non-market-based power relations, so long as you take exploitation as a prior. Weber and social class. If we view exploitation as central to Marxist interpretations of social class, then life chances are central to Weberian interpretations. Giddens best defines life chances as the chances an individual has for sharing in the socially created economic or cultural goods that typically exist in any given society. For Weber, social class is intrinsically linked to the market, in that it is the major determinant of life chances. Thus, the utility of class in a Weberian sense is its ability to analyse individual level positions in markets to their life chances. In other words, Weberian social class allows for the measurement of the distribution of inequality throughout society. Unlike its Marxist alternative, there is no assumption of the preeminence of Weberian interpretations of social class. Instead, it relies upon empirical justification. Tangentially, this is perhaps why the preeminent neo-Weberian interpretation of social class, the Goldthorpe scale, boasts such levels of construct validity. As Weber states in Gath and Mills, classes are not communities. They merely represent possible and frequent bases for communal action. Weber himself states that social class is but one part of a greater whole defining power within society, the other two being status groups and parties. The distinction between the three being the different resources that can bring to influence the distribution of life chances. As for power, Weber defines it as the probability that one actor within a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his own will despite resistance. Pulling this together, concepts of power and concepts of class can intertwine in certain areas of common interest. However, whilst interests of individuals may at times overlap, class, in of itself, is not an entity of collective action. Though at times it certainly can be, this position is more likely to be taken up by status groups or by parties. different life chances associated with social class membership do not themselves give birth to class action. It is only when the real conditions and the results of the class situation are recognized that this can occur. Class positions exist independently of individual occupants of these positions. The ability to distinguish these positions is the basis of class analysis for Weberian interpretations of social class. Ultimately, this is defined through two processes: asset specificity and monitoring difficulties. The former refers to the extent to which a job calls for specific skills or knowledge in comparison to jobs that require general non-specific skills. The latter refers to the inability on the part of the employer to assess the extent to which the employee is acting in the employer's interests. Both these concepts are mitigated through the labour contract, and are crucial to understanding how work is differentiated and how class locations develop. One final aspect of social class unique to Weberian interpretations is the concept of social closure. According to Weber, social closure occurs whenever the competition for a livelihood creates groups interested in reducing that competition. Groups attempt to monopolize on advantages and maximize their rewards by closing off certain opportunities to outsiders that they define as inferior or ineligible. A common example of this would be credentialism, a process of creating artificial barriers to entry on certain occupations based upon an educational prerequisite. Another example relates to union activities and legislation pertaining to specific safety and pay standards. In neoclassical language, monopoly rents are then generated when actors create artificial monopolies over the supply of a specific asset, thereby increasing their runs on the asset over what it would have generated in the absence of a monopoly. These forms of social closure directly influence class position and composition. Goldthorpe and social class. Whilst Goldthorpe himself may protest, the fact that his model of social class embodies a focus upon life chances, as well as a direct rejection of Marxist forms of exploitation and normative political action, it is appropriate to label such a model as neo-Weberian. Neo in part because Goldthorpe also places emphasis on aspects of consumption. The Goldthorpe strategy to define social class relates to an aggregation of occupations based on employment relations into so-called big class specifications. The schema itself can change depending on the level of analysis required. The NSEC offers a perfect encapsulation of the big class Weberian perspective on social class. The core critique of the Goldthorpe model of social class comes from a feminist perspective. Delphi argues that stratification research, in this instance focusing on Goldthorpe's model, obscures the relationship that women have with production practices. The conventional view that individuals within the same family unit constitute the same social class position is one that apparently obfuscates forms of sexual stratification in a form of social class dominance. This once again brings up the key topic of intersectionality. The Twitch streamer Destiny rightly warns people that an over-reliance on social class as a mode of explanation will sometimes obfuscate other core elements of identity.
Online, this anti-idpol community that shuns, like the intersectional people, that says that gay rights, LGBT, all of that is whatever. It's all about class or whatever, right?
Speaking of Delphi's criticisms, however, there are some weaknesses. For one, these critiques appear to be taking issue with the theoretical orientation and operationalization of social class, when they ought to be taking issue with the empirical reality that said theory uncovers. The Goldthorpe interpretation of social class is not offering a prescription on what ought to constitute a family unit. Indeed, the model itself works the exact same way, no matter the sex of the head of the household. In saying this, Dale, Gilbert, and Arber do present an interesting case as it purports to the application of a classification schema designed for male occupations onto female jobs. Once again, however, the classification schema arguably promotes rather than detracts from their apparent normative objections to the differing market situations of men and women within contemporary society. On the topic of inequality and diverging market-based situations, the Goldthorpe interpretation of social class remains a satisfactory analytical tool in describing employment relations via aggregates. Indeed, the continuing empirical evidence appears to suggest that treating broad aggregations of occupations as social classes is still an effective way of analysing inequality in social class and stratification within society. Overall, Weberian interpretations of social class are extremely helpful in discerning inequality within societies, as proven by repeated empirical studies employing a Goldthorpe-like interpretation of social class that embodies life chances and employment relations, as well as high levels of criterion validity that such interpretations of social class hold as a consequence. Microclasses. The microclass interpretation of social class is one that adopts similar Weberian terminology to that of the Goldthorpe model. Life chances and occupations are central. Institutionalized occupations rather than institutionalized big classes form the basis of the balkanization of the labour market. Microclass advocates argue that big class-based interpretations of social class obfuscate categories of functionally similar jobs, to the extent that realized class maps do not maximize their explanatory power when attempting to measure life conditions and inequality within society. Similar to critiques of Savage et al., microclass interpretations critique big class interpretations of social class on the basis that it has failed to deliver on a detailed analysis of attitudes and behaviors that culminate in a multitude of subcultures that are in addition to class membership. Thus, by starting at the site of production, life conditions, which can at times be detached from class position, can be better understood and analysed. Ultimately, the microclass interpretation of social class offers a more powerful potential explanatory mechanism that rejects the supposed declined importance on the site of production. Importantly, proponents of microclass interpretations of social class do not advocate for the complete removal of big class interpretations. In fact, they argue for an almost symbiotic-based relationship based around different purposes. As DiMaggio states, social class is the crack troop in sociologists' war on unexplained variance. If the goal of sociologists is to achieve controls or seek variance within their models, a big class agenda may be more appropriate than employing a microclass model. In response to these critiques, proponents of big class interpretations of social class have pushed back. Firstly, whilst a microclass model may, in certain research designs, provide a more powerful explanatory mechanism, microclass models show little to no ability to demonstrate occupation-based effects on matters of mobility or immobility. Thus, once more, this becomes a question of what social class's purpose actually is. A big class interpretation of social class can successfully discern between immobility and mobility simultaneously. A microclass regime cannot. On this matter, then, a big class interpretation is more helpful. In saying this, however, Erikson, Goldthorpe, and Holstein acknowledge that a microclass interpretation holds great utility in focusing upon the social reproduction of immobility. Overall, whilst each may hold a differing definition of what social class is, they both, in differing ways, are helpful to employ in the wider social scientific analysis of social class. Though they may differ in the ways listed above, ultimately they both share key elements of Weberian theoretical orientation that focus upon life chances and conditions as well as social closure. Bourdieu and social class. There has been a growth of sociologists that have become increasingly inspired by the writings of Bourdieu to reimagine social class under his influence. Ultimately, Bourdieu's definition of social class is best understood by a string of statements on what social class isn't, rather than what it is. As mentioned previously, key to understanding a Bourdieusian interpretation of social class is a rejection of treating social class a priori. In other words, an attempt to reject social class as an entity crystallized as a form of self-subsistence. Bourdieu views social class via the occupational division of labour, like other sociologists. However, Bourdieu emphasizes that this division forms a system. The implication of such a system is that locations in the division of labour are differentiated from and related to one another in terms of meaningful factors. Such a model of social class is visualized by Bourdieu as a factorial space that constitutes three distinct orthogonal axes. The first differentiates between locations in the occupational system according to the total volume of capital. The second differentiates between positions within the class locations, similar to Marxist class fractions. The third is the occupational division of labour, which amounts to a quasi-structural treatment of time. As demonstrated, space and time are of importance to a Bourdieusian interpretation of social class. Bourdieu has three fundamental concepts that are used within his analysis to define social class. They are capital, habitus, and field. Capital, for Bourdieu, can be broken down into three distinct forms: economic, cultural, and social. Economic capital is the quantity of economic resources associated with one individual in terms of income and wealth. Cultural capital refers to the types of consumption practices that an individual engages with, how that is placed within a specified taste hierarchy. Do you go to the opera, art galleries, etc.? Finally, social capital refers to who individuals engage with in terms of interpersonal relationships. Are you friends with doctors and lawyers, or bricklayers and sales assistants? The combination of all forms of capital help to determine your class position. The link between space and practice of social class is established by a means of habitus. Above all else, habitus designates a socially constituted system of dispositions and is differentially formed according to each individual position within the space of class. Finally, the concept of field is intended to foreclose an overly structuralist interpretation of social space. That is, one in which the individuals who occupy the various positions are reduced to the role of mere bearers of the structural relations that are encapsulated within it. A final point of a Bourdieusian interpretation of social class is that, like Weber, Bourdieu emphasizes that neither communication nor sustained social interaction between groups of individuals sharing similar life conditions are sufficient on their own to generate a specific social collectivity, much less an organized one. Conclusion. Social class is complicated. It has many definitions. Hopefully, this video has been informative and it promotes a discussion of sorts. Some definitions of social class are redundant, others have utility in specific areas of analysis and discussion. Knowing these differences is essential to understanding these theories and how the term is used in the real world today, and especially how it can be used within other concepts such as socialism, capitalism, and intersectionality. For those that aren't audio learners, the full script for this video is linked down below, as are all the sources used within this video. No video will rely on pure rhetoric or sophistry. All claims will be sourced, all definitions will be given, either in the video or down below within the script. If you found this video informative and want more videos like this one, please be sure to comment down below and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.